Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Carrie O'Brien. She is Assistant Director of Teacher Support in the Hillsdale College K-12 Office. Carrie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me today, Scott.
Talking about engaging students in math class through storytelling. Before we do, tell us a little bit about exactly what you do inside the Hillsdale College K-12 office.
Sure. So in my position on the teacher support team, I get to work with teachers really from kindergarten through 12th grade. Our team visits schools, and so we are in the classroom, and we're really just there to help teachers in whatever capacity they need help. So we, work through curricular things with them. We discuss a lot of pedagogy and how they can improve their teaching in the classroom. So we get to observe, we get to have conversations. When we're at home, I spend a lot of time working on curriculum and resources for teachers, specifically in math.
And that's what we talk about today. Storytelling in math class. Where does this idea originate?
So when I was teaching Algebra 2 a few years back, I really found that my students were at a point in their math education where the concepts were getting more difficult. And there are a lot of, we'll say, just facts to memorize in Algebra 2 in a different way than we memorize math facts in the grammar school. It's all related to functions. And so students have to piece together a lot of information. And I found that if my students tried to memorize all of these different ideas and all of the different pieces to the puzzle without really putting the puzzle together itself, they failed. Mm-hmm. They couldn't do it, right? And I think that's a helpful analogy. If we think of a puzzle and you just try to memorize all of the pieces of the puzzle, you'll never know what the picture is until you put it together. And so I encouraged my students to think of the whole school year as a story, and we were going to learn the story of functions. And it's really just this idea of building and having some structure in our classroom and in our lessons so that we can help students build the information, because that helps them to hold the information in their memory without having to memorize all the information, which is at some point we reach a capacity. So we want to free up the cognitive load, as we kind of more scientifically say, but it's true. There's so much to remember. So we want to help them to remember as best as we can. And I think story is one way that we can do that, and even in math class.
So this is perhaps more than that old story of that train leaving at 3:30 and traveling east at 70. It's not word problems. This is more than that.
It's more than that. Yes, exactly.
We've talked about storytelling when it comes to history, storytelling certainly in English, in literature. and it always tends to be this tool that helps students. So why is that the case? What do we know about the science behind
Sure.
it?
Yes. So there's a great book by a cognitive scientist whose name is Daniel Willingham. And the title of the book is Why Don't Students Like School? So one of the chapters is fittingly titled, Why Do Students Remember Everything That's on TV and Forget Everything I Say? And so he discusses what it is about our brains that causes us to remember things. And he focuses in on the fact that he says memory is the residue of thought. So he says what our students think about is what they will remember. And of course, that seems so obvious. Mm-hmm. But if we stop to think about that, I think it can help us to plan our lessons and really plan the scope of the whole school year in such a way in which we're really thinking about what our students are attending to. So we want to focus their attention on the right things. And of course, this is true in every subject. But Willingham goes on to talk about the fact that, okay, memory is the residue of thought. So what are our students thinking about? Well, there's another piece to this, which is that he says stories are psychologically privileged in our minds. So if we can tell a story, it will engage our students so that they keep their attention on the thing that we want them to think about. And if we can hold their attention to really think about it, then they'll remember it. So he really kind of leans into this idea of story. And he says that if we structure our lessons to have the elements of a story, then that structure will provide an easy, predictable way for our students to follow along. So he says that we should include causality, conflict, complications, and character. And again, we can do this in any subject, but what does that look like in math class?
Sure.
Well, causality, almost everything in math class is cause and effect. As math teachers, we frequently, will work on a problem, we're thinking about an idea, and then I will say, okay, well, within this problem, how does this one number affect this other piece, right? Or maybe we work through a problem and then I say, well, what would happen if I change this one element of the problem? And so we see their cause and effect. Everything that we do, if I start with the number 5 and I add 3 to it, there's an effect to adding 3. Mm-hmm. And so there's causality. He talks about conflict, and he says that the conflict in a math story, perhaps, is really the question. And so sometimes we approach class where we give our students the answer from the beginning. If we do that, we've skipped over the conflict. Mm-hmm. And we all know, right? We've read stories in literature or watching movies. What draws us in is the conflict. Mm-hmm. So if we skip over the conflict by just giving students the answer, we've lost their attention. So if we start by posing the questions rather than giving them the answers, we're creating this conflict. And that conflict will draw them in. Now, it's not a conflict that's going to upset them in some way. We're not causing conflict, but we're giving them something to think about. And that's where we get them to focus on meaning. He talks about complications, and I think this is one of the best ways to teach math is we take a concept and we complicate it just slightly, right? It's that idea of, okay, well, we have this down. Now what if I change just one element of the problem? And so these complications are building. We might, in math class, we often think of a stair step, and we start at the bottom and we build our way up. We can't jump, 5 steps at one time. And so our complications kind of take that conflict and we're just building slowly. And by building slowly, our students can stay with us. And then he talks about character, and I think we can think of our students as the characters in the story. And I like to think about that because sometimes as teachers, I know I get very excited, and so I want to talk. But we have to include our students in the story, and so we ask them questions. We constantly ask them questions so that they are doing the thinking. Because again, what we remember is what we think about. Mm-hmm. If I do all the thinking, then my students aren't thinking, and therefore they're not remembering. But then also we think of the numbers and the concepts as the real characters of the story of mathematics. So having this type of structure where we have causality, conflict, complications, and character, and structuring our lessons to include those things will allow for our students to be more attentive and engaged, and thus understand and remember better.
If that's the structure of these stories on which we want to hang our lessons, what does this look like in practice inside the classroom?
Yeah. I think this is interesting because we can think of a single lesson as a story. In that case, I think we have to begin by really thinking about, okay, when we read a story, how does a great novel begin? Well, you have some introduction, right? You get to know the characters, and it's not until a little bit of, maybe a chapter or two in, or 20 minutes into the movie, you get the real conflict of the story. I don't think we have to have that much build up in a lesson. We only have, maybe 50 minutes. So I think a helpful thing to think about, though, is that we begin with review, and we begin by thinking about where are the students coming from? What do they already know about this particular topic or concept? Because we're going to build off of that. So we have to think about that introduction before we just jump into a conflict. So then we get into the conflict and we get them to think about a question. We pose some kind of opening question. In our Hillsdale K-12 schools, we use the Singapore Math Dimensions math curriculum. And the way that those lessons are structured is they have a think problem, then learn, and then we do, and that's the practice. And so that think problem is our opening question, and I think that's the real conflict. So if teachers spend some time on that conflict by, again, posing the question and allowing our students to think about it, then we can get to the answers. And so maybe as an example, if we think about the order of operations, so the Dimensions curriculum, this is in 5th grade. Students think about the order of operations. We've learned addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Now let's put all of the operations into one single problem. What do we do? I love how the Dimensions curriculum approaches this. They actually begin by showing them a picture of an arrangement of dots, and the students have to figure out how to count the dots. And so they create patterns. There's patterns within it, and you see that, if I start by finding the repeated patterns, I can do some multiplication, and then we add in we add in the dots that are not a part of that pattern. So we see that multiplication comes before addition. And so we kind of give them some conflict by causing them to think about what would be the most efficient way of counting up these dots. But I think we start to complicate it by then giving them some problems to really think about why it's helpful. Why is it more efficient for us to start with multiplication? And we start to see that, this actually all builds off of what we've been doing for the last 5 years in math class, which is that arithmetic is a way of counting. And we know that in math, we like to be efficient. So what's a faster way of counting? Well, the first thing we learn is addition. And then what's a faster way of adding if we have repeated addition? It's multiplication. And then beyond 5th grade, they start to learn about exponents and what's a faster way of multiplying. we use exponents, exponentiation. And so there's actually a story even built within this order of operations that many of us just learned to memorize PEMDAS, or please excuse my dear Aunt Sally is how I learned it. So rather than just memorizing an acronym, we see that, oh, this is a sensible thing. I want to find the value of something as quickly as possible. So first, we use exponents because that's the fastest or perhaps most powerful way to find the value if we're doing repeated counting. Then we would do multiplication and its inverse, division. Then we do addition because it's the way I talk to my students about it is that it's a weaker operation than multiplication. So we start with the most powerful and then we work our way down to addition and its inverse, subtraction. So we see that within a single kind of lesson of order of operations, but there's really this whole story within just the order of operations that our students have been learning over the course of their time learning arithmetic.
How does this result in more engaged students and better students inside the math classroom?
Sure. I think there are a couple things. One, it's this, again, same idea that everything is building off of what we have learned previously. And so that's why when I work with teachers, I really encourage them to think about where their students are coming from, think about where they're at right now, and think about where they are going, which does involve doing a little bit of research and learning of the curriculum from the previous grades and then the next grades. But even just spending a little bit of time looking into that, say if you're teaching fractions to fourth grade, seeing what they learned about, they learned in third grade what an improper fraction is and what a mixed number is. They do some addition of fractions. And so now we're going to take that knowledge and piece it together by learning how to add mixed numbers. So we want to see where they're coming from, and then how can we build upon that? So again, I think what we're doing for our students is we are freeing up their memory. They don't have to memorize each of these different lessons that we give them every single day. When we piece it all together and we show them how everything is related, it becomes a beautiful picture. And they can really start to create an actual picture in their minds. In fact, in the grammar school, that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to help students visualize math. And so they visualize numbers, they visualize operations, but we want them ultimately to be able to see the grand picture of math as well. So I think that's how we get their attention. That's how we engage them. We gain their attention through structure, and we can keep things interesting by having an organized lesson, which I think is good news. It actually makes things more interesting if it's organized. But by piecing everything together for them and creating more of a story, we are actually aiding their ability to just remember it. Because I think we all know, I think it's common sense that if things are related and they build and there's some kind of maybe story arch that we see, we remember it better.
As a teacher, how does one learn to become a great storyteller in the math classroom?
That's a great question. I think it takes practice. Like all things, it takes practice. I would encourage teachers to really think about their lesson plans. And lesson planning for math can look a little bit different than lesson planning for, say, history or literature. I think that, again, it comes back to what have the students already learned and where are they going? We have to think about what is the whole unit that we're on? Where do I want them to be at the end of this unit? And that will help us to see what we need to do right now in today's lesson. But I think the lesson planning piece is really important in thinking about the conflict and the complications. What is my main conflict in today's lesson? And again, that might take the form of an opening question. It's what is the main concept that I want my students to learn today? And then stepping back and asking the question rather than giving them the answer at the beginning. We want them to kind of struggle with that conflict for some time before we jump in and resolve it. But then we start complicating it, right? We don't just resolve the conflict in the first 10 or 15 minutes of class and then practice and set the students free for the rest of class to practice. We complicate the main conflict. But the important piece there is that it's one step at a time. We don't jump ahead 5 or 10 steps. We take where we're at and we go up just one. And again, I think by asking great questions of our students and inviting them into the conversation, into the story, that's where we really gain their attention, is by making them think. And doesn't that all make sense? We know that we remember the things that we think about.
Yes.
And so we ought to ask our students questions to get them thinking. But we have to make sure that we are helping them to think in a structured, organized way.
Carrie O'Brien is Assistant Director of Teacher Support inside the Hillsdale College K-12 office, talking about engaging students in math class through storytelling. Carrie, thanks so much for joining us here on the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast.
Thank you for having me today, Scott.
I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K-12. That's Hillsdale_K-12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.